In this episode, we're looking at the last footage of people eaten alive by animals, from a horrifying crocodile attack on the shores of Lake Victoria to a leopard's deadly ambush in the Himalayan foothills. But first, we begin in Uganda, where one man's routine morning on the lake puts him face to face with Africa's most dangerous reptile. It was July 23, 2016, and the dry season had noticeably pulled Lake Victoria's shoreline back along Uganda's southeastern coast, exposing wide bands of mudflat. The receding shallows had concentrated crocodile activity along deeper channels and shoreline drop-offs, placing predators in the same waters where local fishing crews worked every day. Okello Wasaja, a 34-year-old commercial fisherman from a small landing site along the lake's northern shore, had spent the better part of 2 decades working these waters. Wasaja was a familiar presence at the landing site, known among other crews for his willingness to work stretches of shoreline that more cautious fishermen avoided during the dry months. He operated a weathered wooden boat with his longtime fishing partner, Kayondo Bizimungu, 40, a quiet, experienced net handler who had fished the same stretch since adolescence. The two men launched most mornings before sunrise, setting gill nets along the shallows where tilapia congregated during the dry months. The pair had launched before dawn that morning, motoring their boat to a familiar stretch of shoreline roughly 2 miles from the landing site. The sky was clear and the water flat, conditions that made the shallows appear deceptively calm. The area was known among local fishermen for reliable catches during the dry season, but also for an increase in crocodile sightings as water levels dropped. Villagers along this section of shore had reported at least 3 livestock taken from the water's edge in recent weeks, including a full-grown goat dragged from a drinking point in broad daylight. Despite the reports, fishing continued. The catches during low water were too valuable for most crews to abandon, and the economic pressure on families who depended on the lake left little room for caution. Wasaja and Bizimungu set their nets in the shallows and returned to deeper water to wait. When they motored back to check the nets later that morning, Wasaja stepped over the side of the boat into waist-deep water to begin hauling the nets by hand, a standard practice along the lake. Bizimungu remained in the boat, managing the lines. Wasaja had his phone sealed inside a small waterproof pouch clipped to the front of his shirt, a habit he had maintained for years to protect the device from spray. Bizimungu later told investigators that Wasaja had been recording a short video of the morning's catch moments before stepping into the water to haul the nets, and had not stopped the recording before entering. Nile crocodiles are among the largest and most dangerous reptilian predators on Earth, with exceptionally large males capable of exceeding 16 feet in length and weighing over 1,600 pounds. They possess one of the most powerful bite forces of any living animal, generating pressures exceeding 3,700 pounds per square inch, enough to crush bone and sever limbs. Their attack strategy relies on concealment and explosive ambush, launching from beneath murky water with enough force to drag large mammals off riverbanks. Once the initial bite secures the victim, the crocodile initiates a death roll, a violent spinning maneuver designed to disorient prey before dragging it beneath the surface to drown. In the shallow, sediment-heavy waters of Lake Victoria during the dry season, a crocodile can rest motionless within feet of a wading human without being detected. According to testimony gathered by regional wildlife officers and local marine police, the crocodile struck while Wasaja was standing in approximately 3 feet of water, his hands occupied with the tangled gill net. Bizimungu reported that the water erupted without warning directly in front of his partner. The crocodile's jaws clamped around Wasaja's midsection, the force of the strike pulling him off his feet and beneath the surface almost instantly. Bizimungu described churning water, a spray of mud, and then a sudden drag toward deeper water as the crocodile initiated the death roll. The violent turbulence moved outward from the boat, the disturbance shifting direction as the animal pulled its grip beneath the surface. Bizimungu attempted to reach his partner with an oar, standing in the boat and driving it downward into the churning water, but the disturbance was already moving beyond his reach. Within seconds, the water began to settle. Wasaja did not resurface. Bizimungu motored back to the landing site and alerted authorities. Local marine police units and wildlife officers reached the area within hours. Wasaja's body was recovered the following day from a submerged embankment roughly 100 yards from the attack site, consistent with crocodile caching behavior. The waterproof pouch containing his phone was still attached to his clothing. Investigators extracted a brief segment of heavily obscured footage and distorted audio from the device. The visual portion consisted largely of muddy water and violent motion blur, with no clear image of the animal. The device was taken into possession by wildlife officers and local police as part of the ongoing inquiry. The footage was not released publicly at the family's request. Nile crocodile attacks account for dozens to possibly hundreds of fatalities annually annually across sub-Saharan Africa, though exact figures remain unreliable due to widespread underreporting. While Lake Victoria's receding waters had claimed Okello Wasadja thousands of miles to the east, the dense mangrove channels of the Sundarbans would soon prove that even generations of local knowledge could not guarantee safety against the forest's most patient predator. It was April 8, 2014, and the Sundarbans mangrove forest along Bangladesh's southern coast had entered the peak honey harvesting season. Permitted crews of Mawalis ventured deep into a landscape where Bengal tigers had preyed on humans for centuries. Rafiqul Malla, a 47-year-old Mawali from a village on the forest's northern fringe, had collected honey in the Sundarbans for over 25 years. Malla had learned the trade from his father, who had worked the same tidal channels before him, and was regarded among his peers as one of the most skilled collectors in the district. He knew the forest's shifting tidal patterns, the location of productive hive clusters across seasons, and the warning signs that preceded tiger encounters. He was among the most experienced members of his crew, a group of 7 men who entered the forest under a seasonal permit issued by the Regional Forest Authority. The crew traveled by wooden boat along the narrow tidal channels, stopping at known collection sites and working in pairs or small groups to locate and harvest hives. The Forest Authority had recorded an increase in tiger encounters that season, attributing the trend to shifting activity patterns in the Western Range. Malla's crew had been briefed on the elevated risk and instructed to maintain group cohesion at all times. Each man carried rudimentary protective equipment, including a clay mask worn on the back of the head, based on a traditional belief that tigers are less likely to attack prey that appears to be facing them. On the day of the incident, Malla's crew had anchored near a dense stand of giwa trees approximately 3 hours into the forest by boat. The tide was low, exposing slick mud banks along the channel edges and narrowing the navigable waterway to a corridor barely wide enough for the boat. The air was heavy and still, thick with humidity and the smell of tidal decay. The crew split into smaller groups to work adjacent collection sites. Malla moved ahead of his nearest partner to inspect a hive he had spotted in the upper canopy of a tree roughly 50 yards from the water's edge. His partner remained at the previous collection point. Malla carried a basic feature phone in his shirt pocket. He had been using it intermittently throughout the morning to record short voice notes about hive locations, a habit his crew members later confirmed, and investigators believe the device was still in an active recording state when he approached the final tree. Bengal tigers are the apex predator of the Sundarbans ecosystem, uniquely adapted to hunting in tidal mangrove terrain. Adult males weigh between 400 and 500 pounds, with females averaging 250 to 350 pounds. Tigers in the Sundarbans have developed specialized hunting behaviors distinct from their counterparts in grassland or dry forest habitats, including swimming between islands, stalking through waist-deep water, and attacking from dense root systems where visibility is measured in feet rather than yards. Their ambush strategy relies on approaching from behind, closing to within a single leap before striking. The killing bite targets the back of the neck or throat, crushing the windpipe or, in rare cases, damaging the cervical spine. The Sundarbans tiger population is responsible for a historically significant number of human fatalities, though modern annual fatality figures have declined significantly compared to historical averages due to reduced forest access and increased monitoring. Based on the crew's subsequent testimony and the Forest Authority's examination of the site, Malla had moved beyond visual contact with his nearest crew member when the attack occurred. His partner reported hearing a sudden sharp crash through the undergrowth, followed by a brief vocalization that was cut short almost immediately. Then silence. The crew shouted Malla's name repeatedly and received no response. When they converged on his last known position, they found deep impressions in the soft mud where something heavy had struck the ground, drag marks leading into the root system, and Malla's harvesting tools scattered at the base of the tree. The drag trail continued for some distance before disappearing into a flooded channel where the mud gave way to standing water. The crew did not follow. Malla's phone was recovered from the mud near the collection site. Data extraction revealed a fragmented recording left running during his approach to the hive. The audio captured ambient forest sounds, then a sudden eruption of noise, heavy impact through vegetation, brief chaotic disturbance, and then silence. The device was recovered face down in the mud, and a few seconds of distorted visual footage near the end of the recording showed only motion blur and ground before cutting out. A response team from the Forest Authority, accompanied by armed wildlife guards, entered the area within hours. Malla's remains were recovered approximately 200 yards from the collection site, partially concealed in dense undergrowth. The condition of the remains was consistent with a large predator kill. The authority confiscated the phone and all recovered materials, retaining them as part of ongoing efforts to determine whether the attack was part of a pattern. The footage and audio were not released publicly. While the Sundarbans had taken Rafiqul Malla, the volcanic wilderness of Russia's Far East would soon deliver an equally devastating encounter for a man who had spent years pictures documenting the very predators that would ultimately end his life. It was September 14th, 2015, and the first autumn chill had settled across Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula. Salmon runs were nearing their peak along remote tributaries, drawing enormous concentrations of brown bears to the waterways for their annual feeding frenzy. Timofey Grushenko, a 44-year-old freelance wildlife photographer from Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, had spent the previous 6 years documenting Kamchatka's bear population across its remote river systems. Grushenko was a quiet, methodical man whose colleagues described him as deeply committed to his work, but increasingly willing to take risks to capture the images that had so far eluded commercial success. He worked alone by preference, a practice that concerned those who knew him, but that he maintained was essential to avoiding the disturbance that larger groups created around feeding bears. His trips were self-funded and conducted on minimal budgets, often involving solo camps lasting a week or more in areas with no reliable communication. Grushenko had established a campsite along a tributary roughly 30 miles from the nearest settlement, accessible only by a combination of off-road vehicle and foot travel. The site was positioned approximately 200 yards from a shallow gravel bar where bears congregated to catch spawning salmon. The stream ran cold and fast over loose gravel, and the surrounding forest was dense with alder and willow that limited visibility in every direction. Bear trails were worn deep into the soft ground along both banks, some of them passing within yards of where Grushenko had pitched his tent. Grushenko's equipment included a professional-grade camera with a telephoto lens, a tripod, and a handheld video camera he used for supplementary footage. He carried bear spray, but no firearm. Brown bears are among the most powerful terrestrial predators in the Northern Hemisphere, with adult males on the Kamchatka Peninsula regularly exceeding 800 pounds and occasionally surpassing 1,000 pounds during peak autumn feeding. Despite their enormous size, brown bears can sprint at speeds exceeding 35 miles per hour over short distances. Their claws, measuring up to 4 inches, can cause devastating wounds with a single swipe, while their bite force exceeds 1,200 pounds per square inch. During the period of hyperphagia, when bears consume up to 90 pounds of food per day to build fat reserves for winter dormancy, they are focused primarily on feeding and typically avoid humans. However, surprise encounters at close range, particularly near active feeding sites or cached food, can trigger a defensive response of extreme violence. Most fatal brown bear encounters are defensive rather than predatory, involving bears that are startled, protecting cubs, or defending a food source. According to the investigation conducted by regional law enforcement and wildlife officers, Grushenko had not been heard from for approximately 5 days when a resupply contact reported him overdue. His family, alarmed by the silence, organized a search effort through a local outfitter who chartered a helicopter. The search party, consisting of local guides and wildlife rangers, reached the campsite within a day of launching. The camp showed signs of a sudden, violent disturbance. The tent had been partially collapsed and torn. Equipment was scattered across a wide radius, and investigators identified bear tracks and biological evidence consistent with a large male. The bear spray canister was found intact and unused near the tent's entrance, suggesting the encounter had unfolded too quickly for Grushenko to deploy it. Scene evidence and the pattern of damage suggested that a bear had entered the campsite at close range, likely attracted by food odors or the salmon processing occurring nearby along the stream. The tent fabric showed large claw tears consistent with bear damage, and the ground around the tent entrance was deeply gouged where something had been dragged. Investigators determined that the encounter was most consistent with a surprise defensive reaction, a bear startled at close proximity, responding with immediate aggression rather than a deliberate, predatory approach. Grushenko's remains were recovered in a fragmented state approximately 100 yards from the camp. The remains had been subsequently fed upon and partially covered with forest debris, behavior sometimes observed even in encounters that begin as defensive. His camera equipment was recovered at the campsite. The primary camera had sustained significant water and impact damage, likely from being knocked into the stream bed during the disturbance. Police reviewed the recovered memory cards but found no footage of the attack itself. The fragments that were recoverable appeared to be from filming sessions in the days prior, with the final recoverable frames showing the campsite and surrounding stream. Regional law enforcement retained all recovered files as part of the fatality investigation. The family declined requests to authorize any further release. While Kamchatka's rivers had claimed Timofey Grushenko, the remote agricultural frontier of northern Mozambique would soon demonstrate that even the protection of fences and floodlights could not guarantee safety when Africa's most efficient night hunters moved through the darkness. It was August 11, 2017, and the dry season had tightened its grip on Mozambique's Niassa province, a vast, sparsely populated region bordering Tanzania, where open woodland stretched for hundreds of miles with minimal human infrastructure. Celestino Abakar Mwenda, a 29-year-old equipment operator from the provincial capital, had been working at a large agricultural compound in the region for 8 months. Mwenda had taken the position to support his young family back in the capital, sending most of his earnings home each month. The compound consisted of prefabricated buildings connected by gravel paths and surrounded by a perimeter fence designed more for livestock management than predator exclusion. Mwenda operated heavy machinery during the day shift and lived in shared staff quarters on the eastern edge of the compound. He was well liked among the crew, known for keeping to himself during off hours and calling his wife most evenings from the operations building, where the phone signal was marginally stronger. The layout required workers on rotating schedules to walk several hundred yards between the residential block and the operations building, a route that crossed an open stretch of cleared ground with intermittent overhead lighting. The compound's management had been aware of lion activity in the surrounding area for weeks. Local communities had reported livestock kills within a few miles of the perimeter, and workers had observed fresh tracks along the fence line on multiple occasions. One crew member had reported finding a partially consumed carcass of a young cow less than half a mile from the compound's eastern boundary. The project's safety officer had issued a memorandum advising staff to avoid walking between buildings alone after dark, but enforcement was minimal, and the advisory was widely disregarded due to the frequency of night shift rotations. Several workers had raised concerns through informal channels, but no structural changes to lighting or fencing had been implemented. The general attitude among staff, according to later testimony, was that the lions were interested in livestock, not people. African lions are among the continent's most formidable predators, with adult males weighing between 330 and 500 pounds, and females, the pride's primary hunters, averaging 265 to 395 pounds. Lions possess exceptional night vision and are predominantly nocturnal hunters, conducting the majority of their kills between dusk and dawn. Their hunting strategy in open terrain relies on stalking to close range, typically under 30 yards, before launching an explosive charge that can reach speeds of 35 to 40 miles per hour in short bursts. The killing method involves dragging prey to the ground and applying a sustained bite to the throat or muzzle, suffocating the victim over several minutes. Lions in regions with reduced natural prey frequently turn to livestock and, in documented cases across Niassa and neighboring provinces, to humans. Lion-related fatalities across sub-Saharan Africa are estimated in the dozens to low hundreds annually, though figures vary significantly due to underreporting in remote areas. According to the provincial police investigation and statements from compound personnel, Mwenda left the operations building shortly after dark to walk back to the residential block at the end of his shift. He was alone. The route crossed approximately 200 yards of open ground with patchy lighting, several of the overhead fixtures along the path having failed weeks earlier without replacement. A basic security camera mounted on the operations building captured low-resolution footage of the path and a portion of the surrounding cleared area. Investigators reviewed the recording, which showed Mwenda's figure moving along the path before a second shape became visible at the edge of the frame, low, fast, and closing from the darkness beyond the light's reach. The footage quality was poor, the image grainy, and washed out by the building's exterior light, with no audio. The shape reached Mwenda's position, and both figures dropped from view almost simultaneously. The sequence lasted only seconds before the frame showed nothing but the empty, lit path. Workers in the residential block reported hearing sounds of disturbance from that direction, followed by silence. A search party found Mwenda's body approximately 60 yards off the gravel path, in the scrub beyond the cleared perimeter. The scene evidence was consistent with a large predator attack, specifically drag marks through the dirt beginning at the path's edge, bite trauma concentrated around the neck and upper body, and partial consumption. Lion tracks were confirmed around the scene. Investigators later identified a section of damaged fencing along the eastern perimeter, where the wire had sagged low enough for a large predator to pass beneath. Provincial police and the compound's internal investigation team secured the security camera's storage unit before the system's automatic overwrite cycle could erase the relevant footage. The recording was retained as part of an internal review and insurance assessment. The footage was never released publicly. Wildlife authorities and local wildlife scouts attempted to locate the responsible animal in the following weeks, but the operation was hampered by the vast terrain. While Mozambique's dark frontier had claimed Celestino Abakar Mwenda, the forested hillsides of Nepal would soon deliver the final story in this episode, a confrontation between a village woman and a predator that had been terrorizing an entire district for months. It was November 19th, 2013, and the autumn light was fading across the terraced hillsides of a remote district in Nepal's western foothills. The forest edge lay less than 300 yards from the outermost village houses, a proximity that had become a source of mounting dread over the previous months. Sabitri Kunwar, a 38-year-old woman from the village, lived with her extended family in one of the houses closest to the forest. Kunwar worked the family's terraced fields and kept a small number of livestock in a stone-walled pen adjacent to the house. She was a quiet, steady presence in the village, known among neighbors for her early mornings and her refusal to leave the fields unattended, even as warnings about the leopard intensified throughout the district. A leopard had been operating in the district since at least early 2013. The district wildlife office had received multiple confirmed attacks on humans in surrounding villages since the beginning of the year, several of them fatal. The animal had displayed behavioral patterns consistent with an individual suspected of repeated attacks on humans, targeting solitary individuals near the forest margin during the low-light hours of dawn and dusk. Wildlife authorities had attempted to trap and track the animal on 2 occasions without success. Both efforts had involved cage traps baited and positioned along known approach routes near affected villages, but the leopard had avoided them entirely. Advisories had been issued to all villages in the affected area, warning residents to avoid the forest edge alone, particularly after mid-afternoon. Many residents, however, had no practical alternative. Daily tasks like collecting firewood, tending livestock, and working the lower terraces required proximity to the tree line. Historically documented man-eating leopards in Nepal and India have been responsible for double-digit confirmed attacks per individual animal, making them among the most persistent and dangerous wildlife threats to rural communities. On the afternoon of the incident, Kunwar had left the house to retrieve a goat that had wandered toward the lower terraces near the tree line. A neighbor, working on a terrace across the hillside roughly 100 yards away, was the only other person outdoors at the time. Leopards are among the most adaptable and elusive large predators on Earth, with adult males weighing between 130 and 175 pounds and females averaging 70 to 130 pounds. What they lack in size relative to tigers and lions, they compensate for with extraordinary stealth, agility, and ambush precision. Leopards are crepuscular hunters, most active during twilight, and their spotted coat provides near-perfect camouflage in dappled forest light and undergrowth. Their attack strategy relies on absolute concealment until they are within a single bound of their target, typically 5 to 10 yards. The killing bite targets the back of the neck or throat, and leopards are uniquely powerful relative to their size, capable of hauling prey heavier than themselves vertically into trees. In man-eating scenarios, leopards have demonstrated a consistent pattern of targeting solitary individuals in low-visibility conditions near forest margins. According to the district police investigation and witness testimony, the neighbor had been attempting to place a call and had the phone in hand when they observed Kunwar moving down the lower terrace toward the tree line. The neighbor noticed rapid movement from the undergrowth at the forest edge and instinctively pointed the phone toward the commotion, capturing a brief segment of distant, low-quality footage and partial audio from across the terraced hillside. The recording, reviewed later by investigators, showed a distant figure on the lower terrace, a rapid movement from the tree line, and an abrupt collapse. Audio captured a brief vocalization, followed by sounds of disturbance, then nothing. The leopard struck from concealment at the forest margin, closing the distance before Kunwar could react. Scene evidence documented by the response team indicated that the animal had targeted the neck from behind, consistent with leopard predation behavior. The force of the strike brought Kunwar to the ground, and the animal had begun to drag the victim toward the tree line, pulling her several yards across the terrace before the neighbor's shouts and the approach of other villagers from the houses above caused the animal to release its grip and retreat into the forest. Kunwar was reached within minutes by family members and neighbors. She had sustained catastrophic bite trauma to the neck and throat. Villagers carried her toward the nearest road, but the closest medical facility was hours away along steep mountain trails. She did not survive the journey. The district wildlife office launched an intensified effort to locate the animal in the following weeks. The neighbor's phone was retained by authorities as evidence during the ongoing investigation. The footage was not released publicly, a decision attributed to concerns about panic and vigilante retaliation against the broader leopard population in the surrounding forest. After initial attempts at live capture proved unsuccessful, the suspected man-eating leopard was eventually located and eliminated by a licensed hunter operating under Wildlife Authority. Thanks for watching. Want to see more? Click on your screen now.